Welcome to the On List. It has been a hot minute since I have done a video dedicated to a single fragrance. And of course, those of you who've been around a while, who've been following me since I first started this whole thing, you know why that is. And the reason is, for those who don't know, it's difficult to do long-form videos about individual fragrances unless those fragrances are particularly old and therefore have a long history to them, or they have a particularly detailed story about their creation, about their release, something that goes beyond the way the fragrance smells. Because you can talk about a fragrance the way it smells and performs on your skin, your opinion about the fragrance, all that stuff. You can get in and out in 10 minutes max with something like that. So a fragrance really needs to have something more to it than just the liquid in the bottle if you're going to have a 30-minute plus video about it. So as much as some of you might like me to make a 30-minute video about a random CK1 flanker, I just can't. Even if I love the fragrance, like CKB or CK1 Scene from 2005. I can't do a 35-minute video on that. There just isn't enough to talk about. Now, Michael for Men, on the other hand, does have quite a bit of good stuff to talk about. In fact, there's a lot of stuff about the fragrance that most people may not even know. For one, the fragrance is a rare example of something being given multiple chances. So most of the time when a fragrance is launched on the market, it either sinks or swims. In the old days, they made big batches of fragrances. They expected success. So then when they would launch a fragrance, in the 70s and the 80s, if it didn't sell, that stock sat on the market and just sold through however long it took. If it took years, it took years. A lot of that ended up in discounters in the later decades, and then we found them as quirky, unknown vintage fragrances that we collect and obsess over. But each one of those was basically a market failure and just lingered. These days, it's much more cutthroat. When a fragrance hits the market, much smaller batches produced. Even the big brands, the Dior's and the Chanel's, produce much smaller initial batches nowadays. They've learned their lesson. And if it sells through, they'd rather it be out of stock. And then they have to make more than have an excess of millions of bottles that they can't sell. So these days, it sells out. You have to wait for the next batch. And then they just kind of do it like that in series until interest tapers off. And then it gets discontinued. But, Michael for Men was one of those fragrances that was still done the old way. Big launch, big volume of production, and then big failure. But doggedly, Michael Kors didn't give up on it. Instead, there were tweaks and retweaks made to the formula, and then it was sent back out into the world, where it failed a second time. And then they moved to a different distributor. A different company made their fragrances for them. And then they had the idea of retooling and relaunching the fragrance a third time. Over a decade after the original launch, actually. And it went, a slight name change happened to it. It underwent, Michael for Men became Michael Kors for Men, and once more with feeling, or once more into the breach, it goes. 2014 was the third official relaunch. 2001 was the first, and then the second was somewhere in the mid-2000s. And then that third and final launch didn't do it. Although, to be fair, the fragrance was significantly modified from its first two iterations on that third launch, so it did better. It did better. but still ended up becoming fodder for the discounters, the TJ Maxx's, the Ross's, the Marshalls, the online discounters like Fragrance Net, Fragrance X, Fragrance Buy if we're talking Canada, Perfume Online if we're talking Canada, blah, 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 Notino if we're talking Europe. You get my point. So, yeah, Michael Kors was just not willing to learn their lesson on it. And the tragedy is the fragrance didn't really sell so well because it was honestly put in the wrong market. When you smell Michael for Men, you realize early on that it's a very different kind of fragrance. It was not really following any stylistic tropes of the era. Sort of halfway a little bit, but not exactly. And it was built on older DNA for a much older fragrance brief that it was rejected. So then the perfumer in question continued to tool and tinker and fuddle with it, futz around, and then eventually got to incorporate it into this fragrance, which became Michael for Men, and then got launched in 2001. So it really had a structure that didn't belong in the 2000s to begin with. And then secondly, it was just a very, very sort of, again, a very thematic, stylistic fragrance that really belonged in a niche line, belonged in a house like L'Artisan Parfumeur or something like that. Maybe Annick Goutal or Serge Lutens, one of those, could have really released this fragrance to greater acclaim in that circle, in that realm of niche fragrances, okay? Maybe even Frederic Malle could have put this out, and it would have been grossly more expensive, obviously. But at least if it was in the Frederic Malle line, one, the perfumer, Harry Fremont, would have had his name on the bottle, which would have been cool for him. He never got that chance, that opportunity. So it just would have done better. Maybe it wouldn't have sold in volume, but it would have done better. Overall, it would have been more of a success. But it was launched for Michael Kors, which was already a B-tier designer. They weren't in that Chanel, Dior, Yves Saint Laurent level. They were in that Kate Spade, Ted Baker level of designer tier. So the kind of designer tier where they typically have their own mall boutique, like a Kate Spade. I've seen Michael Kors boutiques in malls before. They don't typically get a lot of space in Nordstrom or places like Bergdorf Goodman or the real high-end department stores. And they don't get put in like the rich people malls, like the kind of malls, for example, that would have an Hermes or a Gucci boutique. Michael Kors never hangs with that crowd. That's the A-list crowd. They're in the B-list. So, wrong market for the fragrance, but a fantastic fragrance. Now, one second. Ah, yes, here we are. The perfume itself. Why is it so niche? Why is it so unique and weird? Well, and this is stuff that I'm only going to paraphrase because I'm not going to verbatim repeat conversations I've had with people, but some of my friends know that I do talk with Harry Fremont. It's rare for me to get access to anyone in the industry like that. I mean, I don't have people like Alberto Morillas on speed dial. Okay, it's not like that. Or Pierre Bourdon or folks like, I would love to have those folks on speed dial and be able to talk to them whenever I want to. It'd be great to have a conversation with Jean-Claude Elena, but, if I was going to have access to any perfumer on that level, luckily it was one of my favorites, because Harry Fremont is one of my favorite perfumers. So the fact that he lets me converse with him, we talk about all kinds of stuff, politics, his flowers, taste in music, like all the usual bullshit that you would talk about with any normal friends, I get to talk about with him. So there you go. Just a normal guy, really, who's made some great perfumes, but at the end of the day, just a normal guy like most people, right? But we were talking, and I was mentioning some of my favorite fragrances from him. It's never the popular ones, obviously, like the popular ones like CK1, which he co-composed with Morias. Never anything like that. I always like the weird discontinued stuff because, right, all of us are that weird discontinued vintage. You know, that's kind of what we do, right? That's people who are in this or into stuff like that. It just kind of goes without saying. So, of course, I'm going to name drop all the weird shit. So, I asked him one day about Michael for Men, one of my favorite fragrances. And he basically dropped a nuclear warhead on me. And he said that the tobacco accord, not the whole fragrance, mind you, the tobacco accord was pinched from his submission for Havana by Estee Lauder, by Aramis. That he worked on a fragrance that he submitted for the Havana brief. And obviously, his got rejected in favor of Xavier Renard and trying to think of the other perfumer who did Havana. It was Xavier Renard, one other person. But that was the fragrance. Nathalie Feistier, I think. But those two got picked for Havana, and Harry Fremont's submission got kicked down the curb. So he didn't reuse the whole fragrance. So who knows what his version of Havana would have smelled like? Who knows? But he told me that he saved the tobacco accord he created because he loved that accord so much. He took that accord and he kept it. And when he was working on a fragrance just independently of any brief, just like Pierre Bourdon would create fragrances just because. And Michael for Men was up for bid, and he just submitted what he was working on, and boom, they picked his. So he got to refine the idea further, obviously, into what became Michael for Men. But that tobacco accord that was meant to be in that 1994 fragrance ended up having a second life in Michael for Men. So when you smell Michael for Men, you have to think part of that fragrance, the core of that fragrance, could have been Havana in a different world, in a mirror world, mirror universe. That could have been Havana, but it wasn't. It's a similar situation with how the whole, the fragrance that was Havana was also submitted for Tommy Hilfiger as well, but was rejected in favor of the fresher, more sparkly thing that Alberto Morias and Buzantian created. So there was a lot of back and forth with stuff like that back then. It's kind of funny how the industry actually works. So the second thing that's really important to know about Michael for Men is there was a recall on the fragrance. And I don't know if those bottles exist or not anymore, but there was a recall. But I think someone probably bought them because whoever had that fragrance on the first day it hit counters before the recall was put in place, like with cars and stuff, someone probably bought those bottles. But there was a recall on the fragrance because whoever compounded Harry's formula, whoever compounded his formula fucked it up and got something wrong, and that gets blown up into kilos of oil, right? So they had to pull the fragrance off the shelf, send it back. I don't know if they destroyed the bottles, dumped them out. They're not going to fix the product in the bottle, right? They're not going to do that. So I don't know if they got sent to discounters and people bought those incorrect formula bottles, but there was a recall on it. And now the other thing that's interesting, there was a package mistake on the first batch of bottles. So this is separate from the recalled bottles. The recalled bottles are effectively the same as the bottles with the packaging mistake. It's the same run of bottles. It's just the recalled ones, the formula was compounded incorrectly, but at the same time, there were the correct bottles. So it was really, you were playing Russian roulette when you went to a store like Macy's that carried the fragrance. there could be 20 bottles on the shelf, and of those 20 bottles, 3 or 4 could have the wrong, incorrect formula, which would be different and off in some way, and then the remaining 16 bottles were the correct ones. Who knows how they could tell them apart? I'm not sure what they did. Maybe there was batch codes they used. So, in theory, the very first batch code of the fragrance was recalled. So there shouldn't be any of those anywhere outside of, like I said, someone who bought it and kept it and didn't return it, didn't know there was something wrong with it, and just enjoyed the fragrance as it was. Even if it was wrong, they just enjoyed it anyway. But once bottles were put on shelves and were allowed to stay on shelves, like they were allowed to be sold, then another mistake occurred. And it was they forgot to put the word Michael on the bottles. I have one of those. I have one of those first run mistake bottles that don't have Michael on it. So it was really messed up. There was some really bad quality control with this fragrance. Either you got a recalled formula, or you got a bottle that was missing the graphics. And see, Michael is nowhere to be found on this bottle. It still has the sticker, though, that says it's Michael for Men there on the bottom. So you still know it's a toilet spray. Okay, it's the A92 is the batch for this one. And the other one I have here is a different number. So these bottles that are missing the Michael logo weren't recalled, obviously. They just were sold without the proper labeling. So that's kind of funny. And also, for those of you who have never seen the box, if you've only seen pictures of the box is kind of weird. So it doesn't open up top to bottom like a typical box would. It does this side-to-side thing. So it's like this. And then you just pull it. Now it's locked on there. You pull it out like this, and then there's a flap, and then there's the bottle. It's kind of neat, I guess. Now, the third thing is, after they corrected and they printed Michael as it was supposed to be on the bottle, then I think at some point they decided that wasn't good enough. And they sold through these bottles. It was out of production for a while, like I said. Then they did a reformulation. Harry Fremont wasn't involved with any reformulations, by the way, to my knowledge. So they did a reformulation, and they sent it back out, and it had Michael Kors written lengthwise this way. Michael Kors. So it went from no name to just saying Michael to saying Michael Kors, and then for men underneath. And that was the third version of the original formula. So, not including the, like I said, the recalled one. Not including the recalled one. That one's different. Now, the thing about Michael for Men was it had been created by Parfums Givenchy. Parfums Givenchy, okay? And this was 2001. So Parfums Givenchy was not quite a part of the LVMH octopus conglomerate umbrella just yet. They would be, though, okay? But at that point, they were separate. One of the things Givenchy liked to do is the same thing that Estee Lauder did with Aramis. It's Givenchy would release fragrances for other houses. Just extra money, right? You would also see that happen quite a bit. some brands would put out fragrances on behalf of other brands. And usually it was a situation where a very small house, like Michael Kors, very small, didn't have the money, didn't have the infrastructure to directly contact a Firmenich, which is who Harry Fremont worked for, directly contact IFF, one of those guys, and work out a contract. So they went through a third party. So in this case, Givenchy. Kenneth Cole did the same thing. Kenneth Cole and Michael Kors both went through Givenchy in the beginning. So the Givenchy, Parfums Givenchy, is actually responsible for this formula. Well, once Givenchy was completely absorbed into the LVMH umbrella, that stopped, because LVMH is LVMH. They don't want to do fragrances for anyone else. Unless they own you and you're part of their portfolio, they're not doing a fragrance for you. LVMH is not L'Oreal, is not Coty. Okay? So they're like, get out of here, Michael Kors, get out of here, Kenneth Cole. Kenneth Cole ended up going to Parlux and continued on with Parlux. Michael Kors moved over to Aramis. Speak of the devil. They moved over to Aramis. Estee Lauder said, sure, we'll put you in our Aramis designer fragrances division, which is where Tommy Hilfiger was, which is where Zegna was. Several others of similar stripe were there. And they carried on. Now, once they hooked back up with the Aramis division, someone had the bright idea of relaunching Michael for Men again. It had already been launched once in 2001, and then the Michael Kors for Men I was telling you about was in the mid-2000s somewhere. That happened, and then nothing. So 2014, Harry Fremont gets contacted, and they're like, hey, we want to redo this fragrance. We want to make some changes. I'll talk about the way it smells in a second. I know we're 20 minutes in and I haven't discussed the way it smells. I'm sorry, but there's a lot of story to this fragrance, okay? There just is. So Harry Fremont was contacted, and he was like, okay, sure, I'll doctor it up, I'll change it. You know, he was only a few years away from retiring at that point, so like Pierre Bourdon, he's like, all right, I'll get that bread, I'll get that money. So he futzed with it, he made some changes, and then suddenly we had Michael Kors for Men, but now the lettering went down the length of the bottle, which is something that all future Michael Kors fragrances that came in these kind of bottles, no matter what the fragrance was, men's, women's, didn't matter. If it came in a bottle like this, it would go down this way, the side of the bottle. So we saw another relaunch of this. And that version is the version that most people are familiar with, because that one had modest success. You know, third time is a charm, I guess, right? Still wasn't a blockbuster hit. Didn't sell like Aqua di Gio or Sauvage or Drakkar Noir. Didn't sell on that level. But it was a modest enough success that it stayed in production for a little while. It didn't just get one and done. Like the previous two launches were one and dones. This actually rolled over and stayed around a while. And had some flankers too. So it was meh. Okay? Now, what does this fragrance smell like? You've waited this long. I feel like most of you watching this video already know what this fragrance smells like. So you wanted the story, you wanted the juicy stuff, you didn't want to know what this smells like. But for those of you who've never smelled this a day in your life, okay. So the tobacco accord in this is what makes it so unique. It is a very sort of not smoky ashtray. It is not heavy on clove. It is not that leafy style tobacco that you get from things like Dolce & Gabbana or Versace the Dreamer. That's a more of a clary sage style tobacco. Those two fragrances bank on clary sage very heavily. This is trying to create more of a cured tobacco, like tobacco after it's already been treated with tonka in most cases, cured, but not in a product yet, not part of a cigar, not part of a cigarette. So that cured tobacco smell, it's very different. It's very sort of musky, very kind of rustic smelling. It's not your typical tobacco accord. It's very different, and it's nice. You pair that up with a leather accord, and it's a sour, sort of pyrrolone-ish. I don't know if there is pyrrolone in here or not. Harry Fremont's not going to give me his formula, but there's got that sourish sort of isobutyl-quinoline. It's a bit mousse de Saxy because it does also have anisic alcohol in it as well. It has the star anise note, and that's part of mousse de Sax. So yeah, you can kind of go, all right, well, yeah, it's got the IBQ leather, it's got the anise accord. It does kind of conjure a bit of that Germain Cellier feeling with Bandy. It does have a little bit of that in here, trace amounts of it. But really, what makes this special is that tobacco accord, that sour classic leather, and then you get a sort of dried fruit plum note that is paired with two things. It's paired with a lemmy resin, and it's paired with an incense note, like a Somali incense / frankincense style note. So the alemi and the incense goes with that plum and that dried fruit, sort of fruit cakey kind of plum note, and then that makes a sort of faux booziness, like a brandy kind of feeling to it. I wouldn't call it gourmand exactly. Doesn't quite smell like that, but that sort of overripe plum note mixing with the leather and the tobacco and the anise and again the alemi resin and the incense. It is very niche, like I said before at the beginning of this video. Not mainstream, not mass appealing, even in the slightest bit mass appealing, not at all. So this came out as a Michael Kors fragrance. Is anyone's guess how it got greenlit, but like I said, it did, and it's here, and I love it. Now, the recalled formula, I don't know what the differences are. I actually didn't even talk to Harry about that, so I didn't bring that up with him. That is just stuff I read on the internet, because I feel like anything on that level, it's not his fault, because it's not like his formula was wrong. It was compounded incorrectly, so that was out of his hands anyway, so he doesn't, not his problem. So I didn't mention that to him, but we talked about it, and after I learned about the tobacco accord from Havana basically coming over and becoming a part of this fragrance, I asked him a bit about the 2014 version, and he basically just said, yeah, it was kind of just, everything was toned down a bit. So the plum notes were more subdued, the leather's more subdued, the tobacco accord is a bit more pedestrian, a bit woodier, a bit amberier, a bit more conventional fragrance, I guess. The heart and soul of the original is still in that version. It's just been, it's kind of been smoothed over, right? So more palatable to the mainstream market, I guess. And maybe that's why it sold better. I mean, just a guess. Anyone's guess. And there you have it. Michael for Men by Michael Kors. Unfortunately, this is also the kind of fragrance now that it's been discontinued and gone off the market long enough that they're all really expensive. When I bought mine years ago, These were 50 bucks. All day, every day, 50 bucks. Now they're like 4 times that. They're like 200 bucks plus. Just not really fair. You know, as niche as it may be, it's not really a niche fragrance. So, but I get it. You know, it's not my place to determine what something is worth. It's what people are willing to pay, right? But I get a bit sad and also a bit angry because these days, like, the only people who really buy this or go after this are those unicorn hunters that got to catch all the rare fragrances. They need all of the hyped up, you know, all of the goated or whatever you want to call it fragrances. Like they go after that shit. So they want all the stuff, and they did a little, did a lie, did a little, did a lie, like that, right? And then they're not smelling with their nose; they're smelling with their enthusiasm for discontinued fragrances. It's rare, it's vintage, it was expensive, it's automatically going to smell good. They are going to just psyop themselves, right? They are going to self-Stockholm syndrome themselves and just love the fragrance and never actually smell the fragrance. Not truly. They'll never truly actually smell it. They'll just smell the rarity. They'll smell the discontinuation of it. They'll smell how expensive it is. And they'll just get high off that, you know. Maybe they'll soil their pants or something, you know. Oh. So, you know, but honestly, that isn't the audience for this. Even though it is now, shouldn't be. I feel like the audience for this should really be the person who's into niche tobacco leather experiences. The kind of person that would shop indie brands or shop artisanal brands, or would, you know, dig up the rare sort of obscure brands that are doing really quirky, cool, you know, imaginary authors kind of stuff, right? That's the kind of person I feel like would really be in the market for this. Not the guys with their 15,000 backups of 80s powerhouse perfumes. That isn't the audience for this. Even though it is, it shouldn't be, you know. So, there you guys have it. Michael from Member Michael Kors. Hopefully you learned something. You get to smell it, cool. If not, at least now you know. This has been The Unlist.